Some people like stories, others like numbers. In her book, Open Adoption and Diverse Families, Dr. Abbie Goldberg has satisfied both camps, as well as those who equally love stories and data. Today's guest has brought me a huge gift in the form of her research. There are things that I know about effective parenting that I just know in my gut, and that would be this basic premise that truth and transparency and attunement are really solid guiding principles for raising emotionally healthy sons and daughters. So is that only anecdotally true, or can that be backed up by data? Dr. Abbie Goldberg has spent the last 15 years gathering evidence that what I know to be true is in fact borne out by data. Adoption, the Long View is a podcast brought to you by adopting.com. Our focus is more on the marriage than the wedding. Once you fill the crib and are legally joined to your beloved child, your journey's not over, it's just beginning. We cover things you need to know now, perspectives you need to hear now. I'm your host, Lori Holden, author of The Open-Hearted Way to Open Adoption and longtime blogger at lavenderluz.com. I'm a mom through infant adoption to a daughter and a son, now in their late teens, and it's been a ride. Think of any road trip you've taken. There are ups and there are downs, and it's always an adventure. You're always glad for the trip, but afterward and during, you might end up thinking, if only I knew then what I know now. So, here we go. Dr. Abbie Goldberg is a professor of psychology and director of women's and gender studies at Clark University in Worcester, Mass. She received her BA in psychology from Wesleyan University, an MA in psychology, and a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. For 15 years and counting, Dr. Goldberg has been conducting a longitudinal study of adoptive families headed by females, males, and heterosexual couples. Welcome, Dr. Goldberg.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
It's great to see you. And your book was just so revelatory to me, and I'm excited to dig into that with you. Can you tell us briefly what led you to doing this vast amount of research on open adoption and diverse families?
Yes. So my research actually started in the late 90s and early 2000s, focusing on the transition of parenthood in heterosexual biological parent couples. And so through kind of doing that work, which was part of my graduate work, I became really enamored and intrigued by the fact that there was so little research on other types of families and couples. So I did my dissertation on the transition to parenthood for lesbian couples who use donor insemination to become parents. So I was really interested in the idea of people becoming parents in collaboration with other people. So people who have to use or meet or come into contact with others in order to become a family or in order to become parents. So that work kind of led me to think about adoption. And so I sort of started digging into the literature and found out that there really was no research on the transition to parenthood for adoptive couples, which struck me as kind of shocking, given that the transition to parenthood is kind of a huge life transition, and adoption, of course, is uniquely complicated and nuanced. And there's sort of really unique things like what happens before people get to adoption that might have implications for their actual transition to parenthood. So how they approach it, what are their concerns, what are their fears, what are the unknowns, and then all of how things unfold. So that would just shocked me. There was one study out of Israel from the early 90s, and it was quantitative and really didn't go into any exploration. So in 2005, I launched this study. This was back in the days before, a lot of social media or technology. So I literally called adoption agencies on the telephone, and sent them emails and asked them to give brochures about the study to their clients who had not yet adopted. And so I had wonderful adoption agencies all over the country who helped me do this work and, gave my brochure to folks. And it was very important to me that I get couples before they actually adopted, because I wanted to look at that transition. It would have been much easier if I had found people who had already adopted, but then, I wouldn't get any of the kind of the juicy data on what happens in terms of, what people think is going to happen versus what actually happens. And it felt so important to me to understand what was going on for families and couples beforehand, to understand more about what that transition looked like for different folks.
So you can kind of track their beliefs and what happens along the way.
Exactly. And in some ways, very unexpected things happen. And one very concrete example is, sometimes people say in the, pre-adoptive period, I'm only, I really want a girl, or I'm only open to this race, or I really, I'm not open to open adoption, right? And, often people don't get exactly what they think they're going to get, or the longer that they wait, as some people might know, sometimes your attitudes can change, or your openness to various things can change, sometimes just by necessity, right? So somebody might gently say to you, it's probably going to hurt your chances of adopting in the next couple of years if you are not open to at least some level of, say, drug or alcohol exposure, or, if you really are so restrictive about the gender of or the sex, rather, of your child, that's potentially going to hurt you in terms of being placed with a child quickly, or somewhat expediently. So that was important to me. So I started that work. And it just happened to be, and this was again mid-2000s, that a lot of these agencies were predominantly doing open adoptions. And I became very interested in open adoption. I had read some books at that point by the great kind of pioneers of open adoption, and I was really intrigued. And so a lot of the agencies that were interested in working with me and distributing this information happened to be adoptions predominantly doing open adoptions. And I also had worked with child welfare agencies and agencies that facilitated international adoption. So the sample that I have is a mixture, the overall sample is a mixture of domestic private and domestic public and international adoptive families.
And you talked with various combinations of adoptive parents, as well as a few young adoptees. Is that correct?
Yes. So my study consists of lesbian couples, gay male couples, and heterosexual couples. So I did not include single parents for this, predominantly because the primary grant that funded this work really emphasized that it was important to kind of not have every source of variability in there, and to kind of cut it at some point. And a lot of the questions I was asking about were things like division of housework, relationship quality. They wouldn't have been as relevant to single parents, but that, of course, that is a very important topic. And a doctoral student of mine did her dissertation on the transition to adoptive parenthood for single parents. So yeah, lots of variability. And then in the most recent follow-up, when kids were about 8 to 9 years old, we did interview some of the kids of these families, which I think is what you're talking to. So
yeah, I was surprised and pleased to find that the voice of the children were in there too. And
yes,
are you planning to talk to them more?
I think so eventually. To be honest, it was this is kind of interesting. So to give some background, I've been interviewing these families since 2005, and I've conducted 8 different assessment points, some of which have just been questionnaires, but many of which have also been interviews. The kids in the follow-up, when kids were about 8 to 9 years old on average, we had money to ask, the kids some questions. Some parents didn't really want their kids to be interviewed, and that's really interesting in and of itself. So, related to open adoption, some of these families said things like, I'm worried that, asking them questions about adoption will highlight an aspect of their family that is different, when I really would rather not draw attention to it. Or they don't think they're different, so I'm concerned that talking about it will make them think they're different. And then in other cases, it was really things around like, my child's really shy, or my child hates talking on the phone, or, a lot of very kind of age, kind of developmental related reasons. But I did find that really fascinating. I think about 2/3 of parents agreed to have their kids be interviewed. And then of the 1/3 that didn't, some were kids just were like not interested. And then some were parents kind of being concerned about what that might bring up for their kid.
Okay. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but
Yeah.
I want to get something really basic down.
Sure.
How do you define open adoption?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm a really big fan of David Brodzinski's distinction between structural openness and communicative openness. So when I think of open adoption, depending on the context, I could be talking about one versus the other. I think most people think of it in terms of the structural component, right? Like, sort of, do you have contact with the birth family? Does the adoptive family have contact with or information about? Is there some kind of exchange of information between the adoptive family and the birth family before or after the adoption? That's typically what people think of in terms of structural openness. But communicative openness is a very important element of open adoption, right? You can have structural communication without communicative openness, and you can have communicative openness without structural openness. So communicative openness is really like, how do you talk about adoption, and what is the kind of overall attitude about talking about adoption and birth family? I think you call it the spirit of openness. So is adoption discussed openly within the adoptive family? Does the adoptive family approach the topic of birth family and adoption with a sense of openness, curiosity, engagement, warmth? Is there a sense of transparency and dialogue around it versus kind of it's kind of an off topic, sort of off limits topic, or kind of something that's not discussed?
And that's a fascinating distinction, and it kind of fits in with this construct I came up with called the open adoption grid, where you can have both types of openness, you can have neither, and then you can have one without the other. And it's interesting with families living in what we call open adoption, not knowing which of the four quadrants that may be, because when you invite in the structural openness, when you invite in contact, because you're inviting in people and relationships with people and emotions of people, you're inviting in a lot of complexity. And if you don't also have a tool to deal with that complexity, like the communicative openness, it's going to be really hard. And so I see stories a lot online and in blogs and people talking on social media about a visit gone wrong, a visit with birth family gone wrong, because of that complexity, or the child is sad after the meeting, or mad, or having whatever big emotion. So what are parents to do with this? I mean, the temptation might be to just close off contact to avoid those big feelings. But what does your research show about throwing out the baby with the bathwater?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think of that, again, that spirit of openness and approaching both, again, communication and visits, and things don't go right or things go in a different way than expected. I mean, it's really about communication, right? So communicating with the child, what happened, how are you feeling, communicating with the birth family. Gosh, that was a tough visit. Like, let's talk about that if we can, and then there can be some communication and some transparency around, let's hold off maybe on the next visit, but always being in communication about, what is happening. This is how we're feeling. We are committed to our relationship with you on an ongoing basis. Or if you're talking to your child, we are committed to, being the best parents we can and listening to you and being here and talking about whatever you want to talk about. So it's really a sustained attention and commitment, even when crap hits the fan, right? So it's like not just saying, I give up, this is too hard. This isn't what I thought it was going to be. I mean, the name of the game in openness is change. It's change. And that's just life, but it's really amplified in the context of open adoption, where, you meet this great birth family and they're perfect and everything's so wonderful. And then you guys have visits, and then maybe they fall out of contact. And you're, as the adoptive family or parent, you're so confused and you're hurt and you're wondering what happened. And, how are you supposed to move through with that and move on with that? I think some awareness of just that change happens and that can very well change again is really helpful to keep in mind. And I think right now we're all we're getting so skilled at being prepared for the unexpected right now, and kind of being ready to roll with whatever, not because we're so great at it, but because we have no choice. And so I think we're kind of like developing that muscle of just kind of falling in with uncertainty. And I think that's a lot of what parenting is in general, and especially parenting in an open adoption is sort of like, oh, okay, so this is happening. And, not making any hard and fast rules or decisions about, okay, that's it. We're done. We're done with them, or we're not going to do this anymore. But just sort of maybe staying open and sort of thinking about what needs to happen for everyone to be okay. So that's really also where boundaries come in, and what needs to happen to make sure everyone here is okay.
I find in my own experience that anything that I'm avoiding or resisting is probably something that needs attention.
Right.
And not just with adoption stuff, but definitely with adoption stuff. If I'm trying to avoid a visit because the last one was hard, then, like you say, there's something I need to dig into, maybe in myself, maybe with the people involved. And that willingness to go there can actually increase intimacy and closeness and make things better for the next time, that rather than if I just avoided it.
Absolutely. And then I think also just what goes along with that is really looking at your expectations and your wishes, and taking a look at them and acknowledging where, like, sometimes you've been hurt, your expectations have not been borne out, you feel disappointed, or you feel frustrated, or there are things you want to say that you don't feel like you can say. And I think a lot of that's just normative, and I think it requires everybody to do some of their own work, separate from other people, to understand why do I find myself so reactive, when the birth family asks for an extra visit, or whatever it happens to be, really, or doesn't seem appreciative of something that I did, or doesn't return phone calls, but then calls and wants to see the child this weekend or something like that.
Exactly. And parenting is filled with tough things to talk about. Adoption isn't the only one. So I was really fascinated to find in your research, you've made a connection between being able to talk about adoption issues and being able to talk about other tough issues. So I'm going to read a passage out of your book. If anybody's got your book, Open Adoption in Diverse Families, I'm reading off of page 218. So when parents are open, flexible, and responsive in their general and adoption-related communication, this promotes positive adoptee identity development. It encourages more open and honest family communication about other important family topics. Somebody in your survey was quoted as saying, "The openness makes it easier for us to talk about other situations like drugs, alcohol, boys. It's made our relationship more open." And then you go on to say the opposite as well, that the lack of flexible adoption-related communication within the family can undermine adoptee development because you're not able to talk about those hard topics. Can you talk a little bit about that connection between all of those issues?
Yeah. So I think I go into some detail about it, that to kind of elaborate on that idea, parents who kind of decide to be, or who kind of practice being open and flexible and responsive and kind of adaptive in their treatment of adoption-related stuff, can really often expand that attitude or that practice to other domains, right? They've built that kind of openness muscle or that flexibility muscle, and they've become practiced at listening and hopefully maybe not immediately responding to topics and issues that might be really kind of fraught with potential conflict, or that are tough to heart about, that are talked about, that are very scary, like talking to kids about drug use or sexuality, or concerning behaviors, or really anything. And I think adopting a child often means that parents are challenged to kind of throw out their assumptions about what parenthood is going to be like, and kind of have to see the child in front of you, in a way, and the situations that are in front of you. And bio parents experience that too, but maybe in some ways they are even less prepared for that. They kind of have even more expectations that this child's going to be kind of my mini-me. But after you kind of accept your child isn't you, or that parenthood may not be exactly what you expected it to be or hoped it to be, honestly, in some cases, in some situations, when you kind of accept that, you do become more attuned to and open to what your kid is bringing to the table and kind of what you need to do to be present at that moment. And some of that does mean, again, practicing that flexibility muscle and kind of that responsiveness. So
it seems super important to get facile. I don't know how to say that word, facile with turning a reaction into a response on some of these heated things. So a question that comes up with adoptees sometimes, talk to us about, what did you discover around the idea that if the child isn't asking about their adoption, it means they aren't thinking about their adoption?
Right. So, kids don't necessarily talk about a lot of things that may be on their minds. And I think that's something that we as parents know intuitively, right? Sometimes we can see that our kids have something on their mind. They come home from school, or they come home from homeschool now, and they, seem very distraught. And, you say, "What's wrong?" And they say, "All right." So, it's not inevitable. It's not sort of like, a truth that children always say exactly what is on their mind. So kids who aren't asking might not be asking for a variety of reasons. So they might not be asking or talking because they really don't fully engage or understand with what adoption is. So that's certainly true of kids who are younger, right? Many parents talk about how there is like a transition from like adoption, I'm adopted, to I'm adopted, adoption. Oh, I get it now, right? And so that transition can sometimes, before that transition happens, maybe kids don't really get it, or maybe they get it and then it's really a profound reckoning that they're really not really ready to talk about. As kids get older, though, they usually do have more curiosity about their identity and about family origins and differences, especially, again, as they're sort of exploring their racial identity, their sexual identity, their gender identity. And they kind of come to some understanding as they get older of like how they're different and similar to, different from and similar to their parents and their other family members and their birth family. And so, kids often have questions about that, or they have thoughts about it. And so kids not talking about that as they get older, that may have something to do with messages, implicit or explicit, that these are not okay things to talk about. That this is an upsetting topic, that people in their family don't want to talk about it, that they would rather focus on all the ways that we are, for example, the same, or we are all the ways we are a family, and how great our family is, versus, tough questions or things that, they notice that one of their parents gets really kind of quiet when the topic comes up, or leaves the room, or seems to get short with them. Well, kids get that on some level, they internalize that, and that may make them less likely to ask or inquire. So I do talk to parents who say, my child never asks about it and doesn't talk about it. So, then it's sort of like, okay, well, do you ever bring it up? Well, no, because they're not bringing it up. Well, no, the conversation has to start from somewhere. And just, parents, even if they feel like they're talking about it, I would say there is definitely an upper limit. Parents can talk about it too much, right? Like, I think we would all say, like, there is something a little disturbing if we think about like somebody who's constantly bringing it up, right? That goes back to kind of Kirk, 1964, his adoption writer, a scholar who talked about kind of acknowledgement of difference and emphasis on difference and minimization of difference, right? There is some kind of balance in there. You don't want to be constantly talking about it, but you also don't want to totally minimize it. But I think parents need to look at what they might be doing implicitly to kind of maybe discourage those conversations, or are there ways in which you can talk about it that feel very kind of normative? So I'm thinking like, choosing a certain movie to watch, right? Like a movie that deals with adoption related subjects, and that might kind of prompt some discussion, or a book recommendation, even just saying, oh, I thought you might like this book. You don't have to read it together necessarily. Or, pulling out certain photographs or materials and having a conversation. So looking for ways to do it in a way that it feels natural. And again, practicing that muscle of openness.
And I think being willing to look inwards about your implicit or explicit expressions about things, that takes a lot to be able to find that fine line between denying the effects of adoption and the things that come up because you're a blended family, and dwelling on it.
Right.
Those are the two extremes. You want to be somewhere in the middle and not miss what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's helpful if parents just remember, like, I find it helpful for myself just to sort of say, oh, that's me stuff, right? Like that stuff, that's my stuff, right? Like I need to deal with that separately, but being aware of those things, I think makes me hopefully a better parent. And just to say, like, if I'm not watching that, I could bring this into my parenting in a way that wouldn't be productive. Because I'm, for example, so concerned or worried about X, Y, or Z, or this is a really tough topic for me personally.
That's so good. I was so pleased in your book that you would devote a whole chapter to kind of an understudied and under talked about population, and that's birth fathers.
I know. Well, it was a shorter chapter, but I had to put it in.
It might have been harder to find data on, perhaps.
A lot, yeah.
But one of the pieces of information you said is that boys reportedly ask more about their birth fathers than the girls do, and that parents are more likely to think of birth fathers in this way: you already have a father, why would you wonder about him? And I see that as kind of the either or. You have one father, you don't need the other. Talk to us about why birth fathers are seen in those ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has so much to do with how we view mothers and fathers in our culture. And some of it, of course, is obvious, right? Mothers carry children and birth them. And there's a lot of assumptions about a birth mother's connection to a child is more long-lasting and more connected maybe than a birth father's, who is just providing, I'm using that in quotes, material. But that is how some people think of it, as birth mothers are connected to this child. And the birth father is often positioned as really kind of outside of that scenario. And I think a lot of times, agencies, birth mothers themselves, can kind of minimize the birth fathers and sort of their level of importance in this whole openness framework. So I didn't know him. He's not important. And in some cases, it's more concerning stuff, like he was abusive or I was raped. So there are kind of more objective reasons for why birth mothers, adoption agencies, and then by default adoptive families sort of say the birth father is not somebody that we're giving a lot of attention to or particularly want to engage with, as an idea or as a relationship, right? So there's both the kind of broad ideas about mothers are so important, every child needs their mother. Fathers, it's great if you have one, but, you certainly don't need more than one. And we actually see that in my research with two dad families, too, where they're sort of much more interested in getting to know the birth mom, right, than the birth dad. Because they're like, well, the kid has two dads. I mean, like, come on. And what they need, maybe, is contact with a birth mom. But why would we engage with a birth father? I mean, I'm breaking that down more simplistically, but the idea is that, like, I mean, that would be nice maybe, but it's not essential, right? So there's a displacement kind of at a theoretical level and then at a kind of more relational level of the birth father, where they are positioned outside and they actually do really need to fight to be part of this in many cases. So they need to say, no, I want to be part of this adoption plan, if they even know about the birth, or I want to have contact with this family or with this child. And there are cases where birth fathers are involved in these families' lives, but it is usually when they are in a relationship with the birth mom, which is consistent with other research. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because through modern technology, we can break out the biological connection and the genetic connection.
Yes.
And in a typical adoption, the birth mom has both the biology of carrying the child and the genetic connection, and the father has only the genetic connection. So, but as the child grows, that genetic connection does become really essential and a really essential piece in identity development.
Yes.
And I always do want to kind of prep people who are going into conversations about birth father with the child that you should be ready to have more. It tends to morph into the birds and bees discussion, because explaining who the birth father is requires a different level of detail than
Yes.
explaining who the birth mother is. So anybody listening, I want to make sure that you know that it could go there and be ready. But if you're
Absolutely.
open,
Yep.
if you've got
This is
you
your
got the basics of
opportunity.
openness. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about agencies, because you mentioned them earlier,
Mhm.
and the role that they play in how prepared all parties are in dealing with these complexities that come up, whether there's contact or not. You mentioned a case in your book where the adoptive parents were going through an agency that had really updated and modern practices based on openness and truth. But the expectant mom, who was in another state, was going through an agency that was more old school, kind of secretive. And they were hinting to her that maybe she shouldn't be so forthcoming with the birth father's identity, and maybe hide this, don't worry about that, let's just keep this tidy and closed and move on. What happens with such a clash of expectations and preparation for this openness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when adoptive parents and birth parents are working with, for example, agencies that do have these very different like practices and kind of philosophies, that can lead to a real unproductive mismatch in expectations, and it can be a really terrible setup for disappointment on someone's end. So it can lead to a lot of miscommunication, right? Because if the adoptive family is approaching this with, we are 100% committed, we really want to have an open adoption, we believe that this is the best thing, we've read all the research, we completely have drunk the Kool-Aid, it's best for everyone involved, and the birth expectant mother or parents are sort of hearing messages of, clean break is best. They may say this, but they're probably not going to follow through, or it's really best for the child if you just, write a letter every year and that's it. Then, there's a potential for, a match to happen and for communication to be kind of stilted or kind of unproductive. But there's also the possibility that will disrupt and that match will not happen. And that the adoptive parents, for example, in that situation might conclude that is actually not a great match. Or the expectant parents might become very suspicious of the adoptive parents and quote unquote all of their promises. So I think in an ideal situation, both parties are working with people who are, uniformly engaged with kind of a similar philosophy around openness, because that will promote more trust, and that will lead to some shared understanding of what all of these terms even mean. So, what does it mean to have contact, and what does it mean to be open versus I just picture two cars kind of missing each other. They're just kind of not they're just not connecting, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think there are fewer and fewer of those particular types of agencies that, are still promoting the benefits of a clean break, and the child really needs to move on, and, you need to move on, and, everyone should go their separate ways. And, it's not good for anyone to kind of have that kind of contact. But they are still out there. And I know that because I continually hear from folks that say, well, my agency says, we have to have an open adoption. But what that really just means is that we have to kind of exchange this basic information. And then after the baby is born, then we don't really have to do that anymore. So even the agency is kind of on board with the idea that this is pro forma. And we're calling it open, but it's not really open.
And I think you've mentioned before that the level of structural openness by default ends up being whatever the least willing person in it is. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes. Yeah, I think of it as sort of the kind of lowest level of comfort, the lowest level of comfort with contact. That is really usually what it ends up being, right? Kind of you go to the lowest common denominator. And that may change, right? That person with less comfort initially may shift their orientation, but usually that's the party that determines what contact will actually look like.
Mm-hmm. In your research, did you find anything counterintuitive, something you didn't expect to find?
Yeah, I mean, I really was surprised at how much positive shift there was in some families' kind of approach and beliefs about open adoption. And that gave me a lot of hope that adoptive parents, people in general, can change. They can adapt to the reality of the situation that they're in. They can come to see the birth family as human beings, and they really developed empathy for people who they may have been fearful of or been kind of cautious around. They might have initially kind of approached theoretical birth parents with kind of suspicion or fear, but in their particular situation, they came to be very, honestly, very empathic, I would say, and very kind of human, and could see all of the challenges, for example, that this birth family or set of birth parents experienced that led them to maybe place a child, and that were also interfering with them being maybe, always available for the family for visits and so on. So they made a connection between, the challenges that this family is facing or that this birth mother is facing in her life. They're the same challenges that make it really hard for her to show up for a promised visit. And I get that, and I have empathy for that, and I don't blame her for that. I can see it, and I can feel real deep compassion.
Mm-hmm. I'm soaking that in, that there's kind of this evolution towards openness.
Yes.
That people tend to go through, and that's borne out by data in your study. We're interviewing today, we're in the eighth month of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Have you kept up with your families, and how are they faring with openness and contact during these quarantine times?
Yeah, I have. I actually did a quick survey of them when early in the pandemic, like May, and just sort of to see how they were doing and coping. And most of them were, in full-on quarantine at that point. And I did ask specifically about birth family and contact, and it was very consistent that any planned visits were canceled. A lot of them talked about visits that had been planned that they were now canceled. They were leaning on technology more to kind of maintain those relationships. So many of them said, instead of that, we've moved to having semi-regular FaceTimes, which I thought was really promising. So there was like kind of an adjustment, the way many of us kind of made an adjustment to kind of keep up with family. And I thought that was really positive. I did see that some families were very concerned about the birth families, that they were worried about them economically. They were worried about their housing situation in some cases because they were concerned about the effects of the pandemic on more vulnerable folks, which included the birth families.
Mm-hmm. So based on all this research, truly a long view, 15 years and counting, and especially considering what the children in the study have told you, can you boil things down to your best piece of advice for adoptive parents about the long view? And this is a question I ask of all of our guests.
Yeah, I mean, I think I referred earlier to that, the idea that change is the norm, right? Change is the name of the game. It's part of any relationship, but it's especially relevant to openness. So being open to change and kind of almost expecting that it's inevitable, I think is actually, there is something comforting about that, that if we can just stay open to the possibility of change, then we are less shocked when it happens. And I think sort of related to that is really understanding that at different stages in the life cycle or developmental period of the kid or kids, it's important to realize that there are adoption competent, people out there to draw on for support. There may not be an adoption competent therapist in your geographical area, but we're so lucky now to have so many resources online. And now in the world of telehealth, people can see people in other states and can find an adoption competent therapist or consultant somewhere else and get some input. So I think realizing that this is a journey, right? This is a marathon, not a sprint. And so it's sort of like picking up your sustenance when you need it along the way. As a lifelong long distance runner, this is how I like my analogies. So it's like when you find that you need something, like looking around and maybe you're like, oh yeah, I can see something, right? I needed that. It's just more staying open to the possibility that at some point you might need some support, you might need some help, and then there might be years that go by that you're doing fine, you're chugging along, and you really are not, you don't need anything, right? So I think just that openness and staying open and realizing the resources that we do have available to us, that they can be very powerful when we do find ourselves stuck.
So I hear you saying that openness means flexibility and an ability to weather change, which is inevitable. And
right.
If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that change happens all the time and we adapt.
We do.
Find ways.
I mean, it is really shocking if you look around and you see what people are doing to adapt and what we have adapted to. And not to say that that's great, but we should pat ourselves on the back for just adapting. And we all are learning a little bit about our own resiliency, and that when faced with a very challenging situation, we do find ways to adapt. We are more creative and more resilient than we might believe.
That might be the capstone of this interview. That's a beautiful note to end on. So thank you, Abbie, so much for talking with us today.
Thank you so much.
With each episode of Adoption the Long View, we bring you guests that expand your knowledge of adoptive parenting. Please subscribe, give this episode a rating, and share with others who are on the journey of adoptive parenting. Thanks to each of you listeners for tuning in and investing in your adoption's long view. May you meet everything on your road ahead with confidence, capability, and compassion.